The Biden administration has decided to supply Ukraine with cluster munitions as a part of a new weapons package. The cluster bombs can release many small bomblets over a wide area that can pose risks to civilians both during the attack and afterwards. Meanwhile, Biden's Western allies who are at an unease with the decision. More than 120 countries have banned the weapons. What are these cluster bombs and how lethal can they be? And why is US sending them to Ukraine? To answer all of this, we're now being joined by John Blaxland, international security expert. Thank you so much for joining us on WION, Professor.
Good to be with you, Risha.
Right. Now, Mr. John, first of all, what is behind this announcement and why is US sending cluster munitions to Ukraine at a time when there have been so many apprehensions against it, especially from the Western allies?
Yeah, great question. The issue appears to be that the West is struggling to maintain a steady supply of conventional munitions to keep the artillery and missile systems equipped with enough weapons to maintain sufficient volley of fire for Ukraine to pursue its counteroffensive operations. The benefit that is seen to accrue from the cluster munitions is that it can be used to fire over, say, a minefield, and then the spreading cluster can perhaps clear part of the pathway through that, mitigating the need for a lot of artillery shells to do that. And there's some also benefits that accrue from that kind of munition to compensate for the lack of numbers of troops, so they can be used for flank protection along the sides of an advancing column, for instance. But of course, we know that while that is the compelling reason for Ukraine wanting to have them, and the United States has a supply of them, we know that they've been incredibly controversial. In many countries where they've been used, they have generated significant, terrible after effects, in large part because many of them don't function properly at the commencement of the operation. So when they're launched, they don't immediately explode. They look like a toy. They are attractive to children, and they often blow up subsequently, killing or maiming those who might be come into contact with those bomblets. So they're really considered an awful weapon of war that lingers well after the war. And there are many countries around the world that have suffered heavily from the use of cluster munitions. Laos and Cambodia are high on the list. So the United States, when they used them in the Vietnam War, had a failure rate of between 40 and 60%. So an enormous number of the bomblets never exploded on impact. And so they were left for subsequent encounter with humans, and particularly kids who might touch them, and they would blow up. And, this has been going on for years subsequently. So there's a real fear that if they use these, the legacy will be enduring for generations. The Americans claim, of course, that they have perfected the technology and that the failure rate has been reduced from about 40% to about 1%. But the controversy endures because there's still no guaranteed sense that, what had happened under laboratory conditions will be repeated in the field of operation. So many countries have objected. But many countries still, some of the great powers still actually have not signed up to the convention. The United States, Russia, China, India, Pakistan, Israel, and others, and Ukraine in the mix. So there is quite a divide. These countries still, for whom it is lawful to use this, are dealing with the backlash from the rest of the world that has decided that this is unlawful.
Right, you've clearly laid out the features of this lethal cluster munitions, and just to add to that, around 120 countries around the world have banned cluster munitions. But talk to us about if this topic of Washington supplying cluster munitions to Kiev will be brought up during the NATO summit in the Lithuanian capital.
So I suspect it will be. This will be it'll be interesting to see whether it reaches the plenary sessions, the public sessions. It no doubt will be discussed at least in the margins, if not in the main sessions, because most of the NATO countries have signed up to banning these cluster munitions and to not facilitating their use. But of course, the pressure, the Americans will and the Ukrainians will respond and say, well, come on, provide more of conventional munitions and conventional equipment if you're going to object to us using cluster munitions. So this is where lots of political leaders are going to be under some pressure to deliver more, including my own Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, who has been invited along with what they call the Indo-Pacific Four from Korea, Japan, Australia and New Zealand to join the NATO meeting in Vilnius.
Right. We've clearly spoken about the lethal features of the cluster munitions and how dangerous they are in today's time, and especially to the civilians. But talk to us about if there are other alternatives that can be used instead of these cluster munitions that the US can provide Ukraine in a bid to thwart Russia's defensive.
Yeah, so there is the continued supply of conventional artillery munitions. There is the prospect of supplying the ATACMS, the Army Tactical Missile System, which uses the High Mobility Artillery Rocket System, or HIMARS rocket base, for which to operate the longer range ATACMS missiles. That is something the United States has been reluctant to supply. There's been agreement to supply F-16 aircraft, but we've yet to see them operate in Ukraine. There's been agreement to supply tanks, but the supply of tanks is fairly slow. There's been agreement to supply other platforms as well. Australia has other platforms it potentially could offer. It may be under pressure to do so, particularly for countries who are going to oppose the use of cluster munitions. The pressure will be, well, if you're going to oppose that, then what are you going to offer instead? And I think that will be the point of some contention, and very interesting to see how much countries like Australia agree to go more. There's been considerable discussion about our tanks, our fighter aircraft that have been parked because we've replaced them with F-35 Joint Strike Fighters, as well as the new Bushmasters and Hawkeye protected mobility vehicles. So lots of discussion yet to be had.
Right, Mr. Blaxland, my last question to you before we let you go. There are also reports of how the Western intel officials are hunting for signs of Wagner and nuclear warheads in Belarus ahead of the NATO summit. Talk to us more on that.
So there is real concern about whether or not the Wagner groups and other military forces might be used to try and reinvent a threat to Ukraine through Belarus from the north. And also from the southwestern corner of Russia. That is a concern for the Ukrainians, no question, particularly as they seek to pursue their counteroffensive. There's a clear desire not to have to keep too many forces in reserve for a contingency to address problems from the north. But that's just in terms of the Wagner. Of course, the nuclear challenge is a deep one and a very worrying one. But most pundits agree that that's not very likely. China, it appears, has made it very, very clear that they strongly object to the crossing of the nuclear threshold. The use of even so-called tactical nuclear weapons nowadays is really akin to what was dropped at Hiroshima or Nagasaki. That would be catastrophic, and that would present an existential challenge that likely would see a significant escalation of conflict. It would be very hard for China to continue to support Russia under those circumstances. And there are many countries, particularly the African countries and Latin Americans, who've been on the sidelines, who likely would be under a lot of pressure to change their tune. And of course, India as well may well be under pressure to change its approach and its relations with Russia under such circumstances. But all that points to the very much reduced likelihood, despite the bluster, of Russia actually using its nuclear weapons.
Well, absolutely. Thank you so much, Mr. John, for joining us on WION and sharing your insights with us on this. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Risha.
Thank you, John.